These Harbor Freight 15-bin part storage cases are a pretty good deal. Being able to rearrange the compartments or replace them with anything you want make them very versatile. But just case stacked upon case is not a fun way to store parts. Because it's there, the item needed will invariably be on the bottom of the stack. So I want to make a rack or two to hold them. It's just going to be a small rack. I want the top of it to be the same height as my workbench, which is just over 33 inches. I'm going to make it out of some scrap pieces of acrylic sheet. It's going to take 24 pieces of 3/8 inch thick cast acrylic to build this thing, but there are only 3 different shapes, which makes it easy to lay out for the CNC router. Going to need 2 pieces for the top and bottom, 8 3/4 inch by 13.5 inches. 6 pieces for the uprights, 3 inches wide by 29 3/4 inches tall. 16 support pieces, 12 inches long, 2 inches wide, with a radius on one of the corners. And 4 small casters. I do want to be able to roll it around. I have a few lengths of a little under 10 inch wide acrylic, so going to try and get all the pieces out of that. It's a little tough with this small router cutting through the full 3/8 inch thick acrylic. I usually cut it out in 2 or 3 passes. A few of the lengths of plastic are long enough I can get a top or bottom piece out of it, and then get 2 uprights as well as some supports. I have all the pieces cut out, and it's time to start putting them together. I'm going to be using Weld-On number 4 to glue the acrylic up. The stuff is so thin it's hard to pour it and not have it run everywhere, so I like to use a little plastic pipette to transfer the glue to the applicator bottle. The applicator has a 25 gauge tip on it, and even that seems a little too big at times. The glue goes a long way, so it's not going to take much, especially if I don't waste it. One thing I did find out was the importance of really keeping the lid on tight. I had a can I had opened and just used a tiny bit out of, and just put the lid back on by hand. A few months later I needed to glue up some acrylic, only to find the can empty. So I really tightened the lid down good now. After pulling the paper masking off, I will clean the surfaces that are to be glued with some isopropyl alcohol, mostly to make sure none of the masking paper adhesive is stuck to the acrylic. Then I'll be ready to start gluing the pieces up. I'm starting with the bottom and an upright. This layout should allow the weight of the upright to act as its own clamp. I will just have to hold it square and still for a minute or so. To get a good glue joint, I need a very thin air gap between the 2 pieces of acrylic. The gap is where the glue will wick into and start to melt the plastic. My spacer is made of some number 0 piano wire with masking tape as a handle. It works okay, but I need to get some smaller wire. I feel that the gap is still a little on the large size. I'm only using a spacer at one end, and so probably the end without the spacer will not be as strong a joint, but in this usage it really won't matter. Now with it resting precariously in place, it's time to apply the glue. I'm pulling the spacer out pretty quick here. If I needed a really strong joint, I would let it set for a few more seconds before removing the spacer. But I want a little more alignment work time. I'm using 1-2-3 blocks to align the edges and help hold it square and in place. I just don't want the blocks to stick to the acrylic where some of the glue squeezes out. I'm going to hold the blocks in place for about 90 seconds. Now after I take my hands off, I'm going to let it set for 5 minutes before I move anything. If this was something that needed to be crystal clear with polished edges, I couldn't use the 1-2-3 blocks like this. A little bit of glue will wick under the edges of the block and scar up the plastic a bit. But for this, it doesn't matter, so I'm just doing it fast and easy. Now after 5 minutes, I'm going to be very gentle in moving it. That's a lot of tall, thin plastic that can wiggle. And it will probably take like 15 minutes before it has quite enough strength to withstand much movement. I now have all the side uprights glued in place, and I'm still being very gentle in moving it around. The back two uprights are very important. They are positioned with the outside edges right against their corresponding side upright. These two uprights will keep the whole rack from just falling over. I'm clamping a side and its adjoining back upright together at the top, just to help hold it straight for gluing. Then it gets glued at the bottom like the other uprights. Only I don't have to hold them in place, just get them aligned and let the blocks do the work. Again, I'll let this one set 5 minutes before moving on. After all the uprights are glued to the base, and I've removed the clamps, I'll glue each side upright to its adjoining back upright. These will be the glue joints that give the entire rack its strength. To glue these long seams, I'm creating a gap by just barely spreading the two pieces apart at the top. Too much gap here and the glue just runs down to the bottom in a puddle. Too little really isn't a problem. There is so much surface area in these two seams that as long as I get the glue to spread the width of the joint, it will be plenty strong. The acrylic has some bow to it, so I'm doing each seam in 3 segments, using a 1-2-3 block to hold the edges in alignment till the glue sets. I'm not going for a fancy look here, but when the edges aren't aligned, it just looks plain sloppy. I couldn't enjoy telling someone, "See here, I built this." Now with these back pieces glued into a corner structure, the rack will handle quite a bit of weight on it. The front uprights can bow a bit, but the back isn't moving. Now for the top pieces of acrylic. I'm very gently turning it over to set it on the top. And I will attach the uprights to the top the same way as I did the bottom. Only now, I will only give a couple of minutes in between gluing each upright. And of course the uprights that form the corner will get glued as a single piece. Then I will let the whole thing set for a few minutes while I get a snack. Probably will let it set for close to 30 minutes. Some of the supports will need a little work. If I cut all the way through the paper in cutting them out, there will be a little burr at the very end. But that is easy to fix with a medium grit sanding block. Also, some of this acrylic is quite old, so the mask paper doesn't come off cleanly and leaves a bit of adhesive residue. It takes a bit of rubbing with isopropyl alcohol to remove it, but much easier to do now than after it's all glued together. Now for the support installs, I'm going to start at the bottom and use the 3 inches of the 1-2-3 block as a spacer in between each support. I'm going to tape some wooden sticks on one edge of each of the blocks to keep them off the surface. That will stop the glue from wicking under the blocks, making it look better and using less glue, so no reason not to do it. I'm not using anything to give me a gap for the glue other than just wiggling the piece a bit. There will be a bit more air bubbles in these glue joints, but they will be plenty strong. After I apply the glue, I just hold it in place for 90 seconds, then move on to the next one. By using 4 blocks, I can leave the previous set in place so as not to disturb the plastic till it sets a bit. Once the supports for one side are glued on, I will let it set for at least 5 minutes before turning the rack over. And again, I start at the bottom and work my way to the top. Gluing and holding each one in its place. After all these are glued on, I will let it set overnight before I do anything else to it. Now that the joints have reached about 80% strength, I want to sand the sharp edges off the plastic. These edges are sharp enough that if you rub your finger on them, they will cut. So just a quick run of the sanding block over the edge will stop that. And I'll also round the corners just a bit, not to get poked with them. The 2-inch casters I have are about 2.7 inches tall, and that should put me at the right height. I'm putting a little bit of VHB tape on the caster mounting base to hold it in place for drilling the screw holes. I want the mounting base of the casters to be inset half an inch from the edges of the acrylic. I'm going to drill and tap the holes for 832 screws. Machine thread screws just seem to do better in the acrylic. In the past, when I've used sheet metal screws, over time I start to get little cracks radiating out from the screw, and cracks in acrylic are not good. So I'm drilling holes with a number 29 drill bit and then slowly tapping them. I want to go slow with the tap as not to melt the plastic. Then just put the screws in and the project is finished. So the pile of cases will get turned into a nice orderly vertical stack, each case independent of the other. Much more useful now. Looks good. That will go nicely at the end of my workbench. Thank you for watching.